Through the kindness of our donors, the National Catholic Broadcasting Council presents Let Us Reflect Together. The Promises of Advent. Second week of Advent, the promise is spoken. The prophet Isaiah, with Jesuit Father Michael Coutts. Hope and Gratitude. A reading from the book of the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah remembers God's merciful love and faithfulness to Israel. I will recount the gracious deeds of the Lord, the praiseworthy acts of the Lord, because of all that the Lord has done for us, according to the abundance of His steadfast love.
The words of the prophet Isaiah guide us in the second week of Advent. They are words of consolation, words of hope. First spoken to the people of Israel, those who walked in darkness, they remain alive with meaning today. For we know darkness, division and discord sown by leaders, violence in our streets, and a creeping despair that whispers, "Has God forgotten us?" Yet Isaiah's message speaks to each of us personally. We hear a prophetic hope fulfilled in Jesus Christ. It is a call, twofold in its challenge. It is a call, open our eyes and recognize the neighbor in need, sharing with them the benevolence of God. It is a call to open our hearts to see the goodness of the Lord who has cared for us so tenderly and so personally. It is a time for silence, for wonder, for awe, a time to savor Isaiah's words. Here in our country, we live in safety and comfort, far from the daily fear of bombs, far from the anguish of parents searching for food to feed their starving children. What we know of violence, we see from a distance, through headlines and screens. And so this Advent, we are filled with a deep sense of gratitude. We hold in our hearts those who suffer. We remain deeply grateful for the graces we have received. Isaiah says, "I will recount the steadfast love of the Lord, the praises of the Lord according to all that the Lord has granted us, and the great goodness to the house of Israel, which He has granted them according to His mercy, according to the abundance of His steadfast love." Let us be still. Let us receive His mercy. Let us walk in His light. In the early 1900s, laws restricted people of African origin and immigrants in the United States from renting or buying property in Coronado, California. An African American named Gus Thompson, who had been born into slavery, had purchased land earlier and built a boarding home in Coronado before the discriminatory laws were passed. In 1939, Gus rented to an Asian family and eventually sold the land to them. Nearly 85 years later, after selling the property, some members of the Asian family are donating their proceeds from the sale to help African American college students. They are also working to name a center at San Diego State University after Gus and his wife, Emma. God's goodness to us must be shared with others. God shared Jesus with us.
Join us tomorrow for Our Faithful Shepherd with Jesuit Father Michael Coutts.